You think the Viking raiders simply disappeared out of nowhere? Well, get ready for the truth, because the end of the feared Vikings was anything but easy. Far from the image of invincible warriors, the Vikings faced a violent and unexpected fall. The story we know, with them raiding villages and invading distant lands, takes a very ugly turn full of untold secrets. So what really happened to these fierce invaders? The truth is, despite all their strength and cruelty, the Vikings began to lose their power gradually but brutally, when they started expanding beyond what they could control. A series of internal and external factors helped destroy everything they had conquered. Instead of conquering the world, as many think, the Vikings were weakened by their own flaws. Let's talk about the violence. It is believed that many of the Viking leaders were being overwhelmed by the constant internal struggles for power. Not just conflicts with other kingdoms, but betrayals within their own ranks started to erode their strength. Who would have thought that the Vikings' greatest enemy could actually be themselves? And of course, the big mistake was underestimating the resistance from neighboring kingdoms. With the rise of new empires and the resistance from local peoples, the Viking army began to be crushed. Not just by brute force, but by the cunning strategies of their enemies. But the worst was yet to come, and you'll see that the fall of the Viking raiders wasn't just about losing battles. It was about losing everything that sustained their empire. When you imagine a Viking, what's the first thing that comes to mind? A fierce warrior, raiding villages, fighting bloody battles, and conquering lands. Well, the reality is that this way of life ended up being the very reason why the Vikings lost their power. The truth behind their fall begins with something simple, but fatal for any empire: the lack of adaptation. In the beginning, the Vikings were masters of the raiding strategy. They would attack by surprise, using their fast ships to invade unprotected shores and wreak as much havoc in a short amount of time. It was an intelligent strategy, but also extremely dependent on speed and the element of surprise. As the Vikings advanced, they began to grow accustomed to this tactic, not realizing that their enemies were quickly learning how to respond to it. When their enemies started adapting, the Viking raiding tactics became predictable and ineffective. The big mistake was that the Viking leaders weren't ready to evolve, weren't ready to face change. They kept trying to use the same approaches as before, not realizing that, as time went on, the battlefield was changing and their enemies were becoming better prepared. What really sealed the Vikings' fate was their failure to reorganize strategically. While other nations started to unify and strengthen, the Vikings remained scattered, with small clans constantly fighting among themselves. Their own warriors, who once were an unbeatable force, were increasingly divided, with no clear common goal. And unlike their enemies, the Vikings didn't manage to form lasting strategic alliances. The crucial moment came when Viking warfare tactics were surpassed by enemies who had already learned how to defeat them. They realized that, instead of fighting the Vikings in large battles, it was enough to prepare with strong defenses, build fortresses, and, most importantly, improve guerrilla strategies. What once seemed invincible became just a memory of an empire that couldn't reinvent itself. Nothing weakens an empire more than betrayal within its own ranks. And that's exactly what happened with the Viking raiders. Although they were known for their strength and ferocity, one of the greatest threats to the Viking Empire came from within: internal disputes, betrayals between the very leaders and clans. And this, my friends, was the silent poison that corroded the foundation of this empire. When we look at the Vikings, we imagine a united army. But the truth is, over time, the clans began fighting amongst themselves for supremacy. These leaders, who should have fought together, were actually more concerned with individual power than with the common cause. They competed for land, wealth, and of course, control over their hordes of warriors. This lack of unity was one of the main reasons for the downfall of the Vikings. The problem with these internal disputes was that they not only weakened the Viking military strength, but also divided their strategic focus. While the Viking Empire faced the growing threat from neighboring kingdoms, many Viking leaders were more concerned with invading and conquering the lands of their own countrymen than facing their true enemies. They were so absorbed in the struggle for power that they neglected the very reason they were united in the first place: the conquest and defense of their lands. Additionally, the Viking system, which initially worked well, was slowly undermined by a weakened loyalty structure. The concept of loyalty began to dilute, and many Vikings started turning against their own leaders, switching sides for gold, riches, or even promises of more fertile and powerful lands. This fragmentation caused the Viking Empire to lose the cohesion that had once been its greatest strength. At the same time, betrayal within Viking territory created an atmosphere of distrust, making it even more difficult to defend their borders. External enemies, upon noticing the internal division, began to exploit it, allying with dissatisfied Viking leaders, causing even more damage. The fight for power, between those who should have been allies, became the greatest threat the Vikings could face. And in the end, it was this that destroyed them. The Vikings were famous for their skill at sea. Their long, fast ships, known as drapcars, could slice through the waters with terrifying precision, allowing them to invade distant lands as quickly as lightning. However, like any empire, the Vikings had their weaknesses, and in their case, it was the sea itself that eventually became one of their greatest enemies. When Viking navigation began to fail, the Vikings lost the strategic advantage that had made them a formidable force for so long. The big issue is that, as impressive as Viking navigation technology was, it wasn't prepared for the changes. Viking ships were designed for open seas and coastal exploration. A powerful maritime force, no doubt, but limited. As the Vikings tried to expand their domains into more distant and challenging areas, they began facing difficulties with the weather conditions and the unknown waters. More frequent and unexpected storms, as well as the inability to navigate in murkier and unknown waters, started to compromise their voyages. The climatic factor was one of the main reasons for the weakening of Viking navigation. Changes in atmospheric conditions, resulting in harsher winters and shorter summers, affected the Vikings' ability to navigate safely. Many of their attacks were delayed or even cancelled due to weather conditions that made the seas more unpredictable and dangerous. Additionally, as the Vikings began to expand more inland into lands they had already conquered, sea routes became less relevant. They started to focus more on agricultural lands and establishing kingdoms rather than conquering new regions by sea. This shift away from maritime invasions, which had been the foundation of their strength, left the Vikings vulnerable to new empires that were better prepared for land warfare. Their enemies adapted more quickly and began building defenses against naval attacks, while the Vikings, who still relied heavily on navigation, fell behind. But the real final blow to Viking supremacy on the seas was the rise of new naval technologies, superior to Viking ships. With the advancement of shipbuilding techniques and the development of more robust and versatile vessels, the Vikings began to be outpaced in their own terrain. And so, the sea, which had once been their greatest weapon, became an obstacle. When Viking navigation failed, the Viking Empire lost its greatest strategic advantage, and the expansion that once seemed infinite was now limited to lands that had already been conquered. Have you ever heard about the Viking brutality against their own women? This is one of the darkest facets of Viking history, and one of the main reasons that helped generate powerful enemies who would play a decisive role in the empire's downfall. For many, the Vikings are known for their bloody raids and military conquests, but few know the internal abuses that took place within their own communities. The way the Viking raiders treated women was a ticking time bomb that, over time, would destroy part of the trust and support the Vikings had in the lands they conquered. The Viking society, although impressive in many ways, was generally deeply patriarchal. Women, even in the lands they conquered, were treated with extreme brutality. We're not just talking about physical abuse or a culture of sexual violence, but a structure that marginalized their voices and saw them as property. While Viking warriors were away, raiding villages and bringing wealth, their wives and daughters were often left behind, with little autonomy and subjected to a series of abuses. The brutality against Viking women wasn't limited to personal relationships. Women were also used as pawns in power games. Many were given as peace offerings between clans or offered as rewards after battles. The exchange of women between Viking clans was a means to guarantee loyalty and often to consolidate power. This cruel treatment not only created an environment of despair and oppression among women, but also generated a cycle of resentment. And that resentment, later on, would turn into a powerful force against the Vikings themselves. And if you think this was only a characteristic of conquered peoples, think again. Some reports suggest that even the Viking clans were increasingly dissatisfied with the lack of rights and violence against their women. This internal dissatisfaction wasn't confined to Viking lands. The enemies of the Vikings, upon noticing the abuses and the instability they caused, began to ally with women from different tribes who revolted against the oppression they endured. These new allies formed a resistance so strong that, over time, it would become one of the main reasons for the decline of the Vikings. As Viking brutality against women spread, the Viking Empire lost the support of the local population, who began to see the invaders not as liberators but as tyrants. When their own allies turned against them, the resistance grew stronger. And without the support of the communities they had once conquered, the Vikings began to lose their victories, one by one. Religion can be one of the most powerful forces an empire can face. And that's exactly what happened to the Vikings. While the Vikings were known for their warrior culture and polytheism, the rise of Christianity throughout Europe posed a direct and relentless threat to their way of life. What began as a religious movement transformed into a battle for the soul of the lands the Vikings had conquered. Christianity not only challenged the Vikings' core beliefs, but also placed them in a religious war that would ultimately destroy much of the Viking Empire's foundations. For centuries, the Vikings had lived in a society where gods like Odin and Thor were the foundation of their morality and daily practices. Viking culture was deeply intertwined with the worship of the gods and the reverence for ancestors. But as Christian missionaries began to travel through the northern lands of Europe, a silent war began to unfold. Christianity brought with it a message of unity and a single truth, something that was entirely opposite to the religious pluralism the Vikings practiced. It wasn't just a change of faith, it was a profound transformation in the way the Vikings viewed the world. The Vikings' resistance was fierce. For decades, Christian incursions were met with hostility. with Vikings attacking monasteries and destroying churches. But as Christianity spread, it began to shape political and social alliances in a way the Vikings couldn't foresee. Kings and landlords in territories conquered by the Vikings began converting to Christianity, not just for faith but for power. Christianity was becoming the new standard for those who wanted to ally with the growing Christian empire. And eventually Viking leaders could no longer ignore it. What many don't realize is that, while the Vikings were busy warring and raiding, Christian kingdoms were organizing themselves, forming alliances, and building a solid infrastructure supported by a common faith. While the Vikings were a mixture of clans, without centralized unity, Christians were building more cohesive and powerful empires, united by the same belief in the growing influence of the church. Christians began to see the Vikings not as warriors to be respected but as pagans who needed to be converted or destroyed. Over time, forced conversions and holy wars diminished Viking resistance. Those who resisted were massacred or assimilated. The religious pressure was so strong that many Vikings were forced to abandon their own gods in the name of survival. Christianity not only conquered the hearts of the people but also the hearts of rulers, who saw the church's support as a way to secure stability and power. The conversion of key figures, like the kings of Denmark and Norway, marked the final fall of Viking resistance and the rise of a new era for Scandinavia. This process wasn't fast or simple, but religious pressure, along with growing political alliances, was what truly weakened the Vikings' internal cohesion. Forced conversions and new alliances caused the old power structures to crumble. Christianity brought with it a new order, and this new order helped bury the Viking Empire once and for all. The fall of the Vikings wasn't just about losing one or two battles, it was the loss of an entire empire, of an identity, and an era that shaped Northern Europe. While the battles they fought on distant seas and lands helped consolidate their fame as invincible warriors, in the end, the Vikings began to lose ground, not only in battles but in their own morality and cohesion. But what really happened to the Viking heroes who were once the soul of their greatness? The Viking warriors, once unbeatable, began to be defeated in major confrontations. Famous battles like the Battle of Maldon, where a Viking army defeated the Saxons, gave way to humiliating losses that exposed the empire's flaws. The decline in military prowess, combined with growing internal and external pressure, made the Vikings lose their advantages. What was once a formidable Viking force on the seas was now being outpaced by more modern and organized strategies. But more than the lost battles, what truly impacted the fall of the Vikings was the transformation of their heroic figures into shadows of what they once were. Men like Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the greatest heroes of Viking culture, became symbols of an era that was dying. Ragnar, the great leader, was finally captured and executed, signaling the end of an era of warrior kings and legendary heroes. His stories, filled with grand feats and epic victories, began to be seen as tales of a time that would never return. The future generations of Vikings no longer saw the heroes as invincible figures, but as ordinary men who had failed. Ragnar, a figure who symbolized the Viking zenith, died as a martyr representing the collapse of an empire. As Viking culture disintegrated, its heroes became a symbol of a futile resistance, a fight that, though fierce, no longer had a place in the New World Order. Future generations began to view the Vikings differently, as a warrior culture. Yes, but also as a civilization that failed to evolve and adapt to the growing power of Christian empires and new war strategies. And what happened to the surviving heroes? Many faded into the shadows of history, transformed into mythological figures buried under the ruins of a broken empire. Some were assimilated by other kingdoms and lost their Viking identity. Others surrendered to Christian pressure, converting to ensure their survival, while others were simply forgotten. Those who weren't killed or assimilated, who continued to resist, were relegated to legends, mere shadows of an era that vanished forever. The end of the Viking era wasn't just the end of an empire. It was the end of a generation of heroes who represented strength and resistance. They fell, not in epic battles, but in the inevitable wear and tear of a changing world, where the old warriors were defeated by a lack of adaptation, the rising shift in power, and the resistance to what the world was becoming. Although the Vikings are widely recognized for their military conquests and raids, few know that one of the greatest factors in the fall of their empire was economic collapse. Yes, you read that right. The same fierce warriors and raiders were actually on the brink of bankruptcy, and it all started with something seemingly simple, yet devastating overextension. At the height of their power, the Vikings were conquering vast lands, from northern Europe to the British Isles, and even south to France and east to Russia. But as they expanded, they began facing what every expanding empire faces: the cost of maintaining their territory. And, without the proper financial and logistical resources to sustain such a vast empire, local economies began to deteriorate. The Vikings were known for their quick and effective raids, but their economy was not structured to handle an empire as large as the one they were building. Unlike the empires that followed, such as the Roman Empire, which had a well-developed and complex economic system, the Vikings relied heavily on their conquests and plunder to maintain their wealth. As the conquered lands expanded, the need for supplies, tributes, and maintenance grew exponentially, and the Vikings simply couldn't keep up with this demand. Another major mistake was the lack of a centralized and organized governance system, with many scattered clans and leaders. Managing the wealth of the Viking Empire was extremely fragmented. Instead of creating an interconnected economy, the Vikings operated more autonomously, with each clan taking care of its own interests. This decentralized system made it difficult to collect taxes and maintain a stable trade, which left the empire vulnerable to collapse. Overextension also affected the Vikings' ability to properly defend their new lands. To protect their vast territories, the Vikings needed to maintain a large and well-trained army, but how could they do that if their economy wasn't functioning efficiently? The lack of financial resources and the pressure to maintain expansion eventually overloaded the empire. Their enemies, on the other hand, were organizing themselves economically, building efficient defense systems, and creating infrastructures that supported their military forces. Finally, the rise of other better-structured empires, such as the Christian empires, accelerated the Viking downfall. While the Vikings were struggling to manage their vast lands, Christian kingdoms were creating a strong market economy, driven by agriculture, trade, and taxes, enabling them to invest in stronger defenses and more efficient armies. When the Vikings could no longer sustain their expansion, their financial vulnerability led to the collapse of the empire. Thus, the Viking Empire, which seemed unbeatable and indestructible, eventually sank into a financial abyss, a result of overextension without proper economic planning. This economic collapse, combined with a lack of centralized structure and external pressure, became one of the greatest factors in the Vikings' fall.